Over the course of several administrations, the military has overused and undermaintained too many weapon systems for too long. And for years, the services have stretched to meet demanding operational needs with fewer people, older equipment and facilities, and a shrinking industrial base. At the same time, the department is all too often not realistically planned for how to sustain ships, aircraft, ground vehicles, and other systems. And across the services, we found a lack of spare parts, maintainers, repair facilities, technical data, training, and other problems. And as a result, too many systems that taxpayers have spent billions to build and maintain are not mission capable.
So playing year-round Santa of weapons to Taiwan and Israel and Ukraine while skimping on maintenance of our own equipment, it appears that this has had consequences. And what I'm afraid of, which is an educated fear, is that we're not ready for a huge war.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, friend, and thank you for listening to the 335th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today's episode is going to be a summary of February 2026. And I will tell you that most of what was accomplished was in one law that funded 5 segments of our government. So most of the episode today is going to be about that. And I'll tell you that you're not going to hear every single thing that was in that funding law because that would be incredibly boring. But I am going to tell you what was most interesting to me, either because it made significant changes or is scandalous, or because it's something that could affect you. And I want to give you this information. I've kind of changed the structure of the show and started doing these episodes because I've realized that the purpose of this show, what I really want to give you here is an opportunity to perform a job performance review of your members of Congress. And I will admit that I lost my shit in the last episode because I was and still am just so disgusted by the job performance of Republicans in the 119th Congress. Because for years, I watched Congress after Congress debate and do essentially nothing about unconstitutional warrantless surveillance authorized during the George W. Bush years. But now, we've progressed to a warrantless entrance of our homes, and Republicans, the party of liberty, they don't even want to hear it. So there's fire in my veins right now, and I know that I needed vacation, and I am going to take one in April. But my performance review seems pretty clear. But this is our show. This is our country. This is our Congress. And so the job performance should be judged by all of us. And so on Patreon, there is a poll for January and February where you can grade the job performance of the Congress for those months and leave your thoughts for why you gave the grade that you did. And I'm going to read some of my favorite report cards at the end of the next summary episode for February. Now, these polls are going to be open to everyone on Patreon on the Congressional Dish page, but I am inclined to care more about the report cards submitted by producers to the show, basically the people who are paying for it. Not only because, just being honest, the opinions of those who help me produce this show simply matter more to me than the opinions of those who don't, but also as people with access to the Last Week in Congress episodes, people who pay for this show are also simply better informed in their job performance evaluations. And so if you want a chance to share your thoughts with the entire Congressional Dish community, participate in our value for value business model, and participate in those polls, you might be heard on the air. And just in case you don't know this, I am offering bonus content now. That's what the Last Week in Congress episodes are. But I just also want to be crystal clear, because I don't think this has been clear lately. That's not what I'm asking you to pay for. The bonus episodes are literally free for producers. It's the public episodes which matter. These are the fact-checked, extensively researched episodes. Last Week in Congress, there's value there for sure, but those episodes are going to have mistakes and a lot of opinion. That's why they're freebies. The true value is right here in the public episode. And why is that? It's the research. So for this episode, the bill that funded the 5 sections of government was 567 pages single-spaced. And I listen to 4, maybe 5 hearings. Like I listen to hearings all the time that are total duds that you don't even know about. But that's what you've got to do to find the sound clip gold. And so these episodes are more labor intensive than you could ever know. And so if it sounds sometimes like my brain is breaking with anger, you try listening to members of Congress for hours and hours every workday and tell me how your mental health is holding up. But these public episodes, these are also the ones that we do the fact checks, and we have very extensive show notes. We have highlights of PDFs of the bills so that you can easily find the provisions that I tell you about, and you can see any notes that I make in the bills. You can also see the articles and the documents and the government reports. You can look at the hearings. You can see the timestamps of the clips that I play for you and the transcripts so that you can check my edits and make sure I'm being fair. I don't ask you to trust me because I know this job sometimes makes me insane. I don't want you to trust me. Trust the show notes because I back up everything I say. And these public episodes, like there is analysis, and I do think that has value. Like I've been working on this podcast for 13 years straight. And so my analysis and yes, my frustration is well informed. But I don't tell you how to feel about this information. I'll tell you how I feel. But I do think there is value in understanding the opinion of someone who has studied Congress more than 99.99999% of people on Earth for the past decade and a half. I'm angry for a reason, for a lot of reasons. And I don't think I do you any favors by holding those back, and so I don't. All of that is value, and all of that on these public episodes is given to you upfront for free. But none of it is actually free. I have a small team who help me with the work, and I need to make a living too. And I do make decent money, and thank you for everyone who makes that possible. I've accepted, though, that I will never make like cable TV money doing this job, but like I do make, fine dining waitress money. But if the money continues to go below that, I can do something else. Something that probably won't keep me up at night the way the weight of the world does as the host of this show. And so if you want me to continue with this show, I do need you to pay for the episodes that are free and available to the public, because the bonuses are just that. They're bonuses. And so if you don't want the bonus episodes, that's fine. But that doesn't excuse you from participating in this business model. Because if you don't participate, then I won't either. But the choice, it's entirely up to you. And you can find every way to contribute to this show on the Support the Show page on congressionaldish.com. And if I sound a little mentally frazzled, you can also help me with those Venmo dings. Those have stepped up a little bit lately, and I'm telling you, it helps. So thank you to everyone who's been sending me the Venmos. But yeah, please support the show. So February began with the second shutdown of the 119th Congress. But the shutdown was so short that I'm guessing that most of us probably didn't even notice. Now, that short shutdown happened because at the end of January, Congress had intended to fund the remaining 6 out of 12 required funding bills for 2026 and to be fully finished with funding for the year, only 4 months late, even though funding for Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol, both parts of the Department of Homeland Security, well, funding for them was controversial because of all of their lawlessness lately. And I had a whole explanation here of all the procedural games that were played, but then I decided who cares. All you really need to know is that the House, using some trickery, had sent a package of all 6 bills to the Senate in order to force the Department of Homeland Security funding into law, or else we would get another long shutdown affecting a large swath of government agencies. But then Alex Peretti was killed in Minnesota. Now, if you're listening to this episode in 2026, you probably know exactly who Alex Peretti is. But if you're listening to this as a recording of history, Alex Peretti was an intensive care nurse in Minnesota who was nonviolently protesting Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who had for months been terrorizing the citizens of Minneapolis. They were arresting innocent people and kidnapping people off the streets and from their businesses, and without warrants, kidnapping people from their homes and deporting quite a few of them. Alex Peretti and many others disapproved of ICE's behavior and Border Patrol's behavior, and so they went out into the streets to film and to yell and to bear witness. And while people, including Alex Peretti, were filming using their cell phones, officers, Customs and Border Patrol agents actually, despite Minneapolis being hundreds of miles away from the nearest U.S. border, Well, Customs and Border Patrol agents tackled Alex Preddy to the ground, and while he was being held down by multiple agents, another agent shot Alex Preddy in the back over and over again. We all saw the video. It was an undeniable execution in public. And the anger in this country, I know it still rages in my veins. I see ICE as an agency out of control. And so then suddenly giving ICE billions of dollars in additional tax money with no restrictions on their out of control behavior became political suicide, at least for Democrats who seem to care about us getting shot and killed in the streets. And as I record this episode, I'm recording this on March 27th, the Department of Homeland Security is still shut down because the Republicans in Congress are against adding any behavioral restrictions on ICE. And the way that the Department of Homeland Security got shut down is that after Alex Preddy was murdered by DHS agents, the Senate Republicans split up the funding bills. They passed 5 of the 12, and then the Department of Homeland Security was the only one that remained unfunded. And so the Senate voted 71-29 to pass those 5 funding bills on Friday, January 30th. But because the House of Representatives was on vacation again, we had to wait until the next week for them to get back to work, to vote, and to send the funding bills to President Trump's desk. And so on January 31st, February 1st, and February 2nd, about 70% of our federal government was shut down again. The law that reopened the government on February 3rd funded, like I said, 5 of the 12 segments of government, including defense, labor, health and human services and education, transportation and housing, financial services, and the State Department. And that law kicked the deadline to fund the Department of Homeland Security until Friday, February 13th, a deadline that passed. And like I said, today, on March 27th, the Department of Homeland Security remains shut down, which really doesn't affect most of us because the Department of Homeland Security workers are required to keep working just without being paid, which is incredibly unfair. Because I do just need to point out that the Republicans appropriated over $70 billion to ICE in their big, beautiful bill last summer. That's more than 7 times what they generally get in 1 year. And so the ICE agents, they have plenty of money. They've been paid this whole time. And so during this shutdown, it's actually the people who haven't been causing these problems. It's the Coast Guard, it's the Secret Service, it's TSA agents. It's the people who have not hurt anyone who are the ones whose paychecks are being held hostage. It's shameful and unfair, which is a good way to describe the actions of the Republican-controlled 119th Congress in general. But this is a summary of what was accomplished in February, and they did fund 5 sections of government for 2026, 4 months late. And so let's take a look at what became law. So first up, let's look at the Department of Defense. Congress gave the Defense Department about $8.5 billion more than the Defense Department asked for a total of about $840 billion. But that was not enough, apparently, because President Trump wants $1.5 trillion for war in 2027. And now we know why. Because after this law with all of the war money was signed on February 3rd, President Trump started bombing Iran on February 28th, which makes Section 8110 of this law important. It says, quote, "None of the funds made available by this act may be used in contravention of the War Powers Resolution," unquote. The War Powers Resolution says that the president can introduce U.S. forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities are likely only under 3 circumstances. 1, if there's a declaration of war, which a month into this war, he's calling an excursion, so that hasn't happened. Or 2, if there's a specific statutory authorization from Congress, which he definitely does not have. Or 3, if there's a national emergency created by an attack on the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. And we attacked Iran first, and so he didn't meet this criteria either. And this is why people are referring to his war as illegal. But the president does have some powers to act on his own, and he's using those authorities. But you should know that unless Congress declares war or passes specific authorization, the president is generally supposed to end the use of forces within 60 days, with a possible 30-day withdrawal period allowed if needed for safe disengagement. And so people often refer to this as the 60 to 90-day rule. Now, the bombs started falling on the last day of February, and so by the end of April, our forces that are currently on their way to the Middle East are supposed to be turned back around unless Congress gives permission for this war in an election year. which is just something to keep in mind. Because I can tell you after reading every single section of this bill, the Iran war was not authorized nor funded, even though Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is requesting $200 billion specifically for the Iran war. But he does not have that yet. And with this funding law finished, that $200 billion will have to be dingleberried onto something else or passed into law on its own. Good luck with that during an election year. And while we're on the topic of the Iran war, we might as well talk about our partner in this war, Israel. Because on top of joining them in yet another extraordinarily violent clusterfuck, which is making us the bad guys in the eyes of so much of the world, we are, as usual, giving Israel billions of dollars. Israel is going to get their usual $3.3 billion of our tax money for weapons. And on top of that, they're going to get an additional $500 million from our procurement budget that will go to Israel's missile defense system. We're also still paying off Israel's neighbors to ensure that they help Israel. So for example, the new law allows, but doesn't require, us to spend $500 million to support Jordan's military. Jordan, which sits between Israel and Iran. Because in order to protect Israel, we need to be on Jordan's good side in order to use their airspace. And so I see this as a subsidy to Israel too. And I do want to tell you what we're doing for the poor people of Palestine, who we have paid to help Israel mass murder at a disgusting scale since the end of 2023. And as I told you already, we are giving another $3.8 billion to Israel for weapons with no behavioral restrictions despite the shocking violence in their well-documented war crimes. And so as for Palestine, well, there's no money specifically set aside for helping Palestinians. And where funding is allowed to be directed towards them, there are literal pages of restrictions. The one that nauseated me the most was the one that said that no funding can go to the West Bank or Gaza unless steps are taken by the Palestinians to, quote, end torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment of detainees, including by bringing to justice members of Palestinian security forces who commit such crimes, unquote. Which is fine. That's totally reasonable. But there is no similar requirement for Israeli torturers who have been documented over and over and over again since before October 7th, 2023, abusing Palestinian prisoners to the point of death. And the proof of that is in the show notes for you. But in every instance in this law, the burden of ensuring peace between Israel and Palestine is placed on the Palestinians, despite Israel clearly being the more powerful country. Not once are the Israelis threatened with defunding if they commit acts of violence. In fact, there's a provision in this law that says that funding for the Palestinians will be cut off if, quote, the Palestinians initiate an international criminal court judicially authorized investigation or actively support such an investigation that subjects Israeli nationals to an investigation for alleged crimes against Palestinians, unquote. So we won't even allow Palestinians to seek justice. Forget about them actually receiving it. And while we constantly hear that Israel, which does exist, has a right to exist, our law prevents the true existence of Palestine by cutting off funding if the Palestinians, quote, obtain the same standing as member states or full membership as a state in the United Nations, outside an agreement negotiated between Israel and Palestine, unquote. And so Palestine can only exist with Israel's permission, while Palestinians in the same law must unequivocally recognize Israel as a country before they get a penny. And if Palestine ever gets to officially exist, and there are so many hurdles making that a very, very hard thing to accomplish, but if they do ever officially exist, there are multiple provisions that require Palestinians to submit themselves to oversight by Israel. And so in our law, there is not even the pretension that the two countries would ever have equal rights. Palestine is either subservient to Israel or it will never exist. That is clearly U.S. policy in this law. And the fact that these provisions made it into law without any kind of resistance that I witnessed, and I pay more attention to most, it shows that the double standard when it comes to Israel and Palestine is glaring and bipartisan. There is no way anyone can objectively look at our policy towards the two sides and call it fair. On the other side of the world, we're also giving our tax money to Taiwan, which will get over $1.1 billion that will be used to buy them weapons and services, military education, and training. And the law says that we can give Taiwan weapons off of our shelves and replace those weapons, just like we've been doing with Ukraine and Israel. And it does make you wonder, how many weapons we could possibly have left on our shelves. And that curiosity led me to listen to, I think, 4 or 5 hearings with military generals who always feed Congress all kinds of happy talk. But in one hearing, there was a witness who had no incentive to engage in happy bullshit. And that was Diana Maurer. She is the Director of Defense Capabilities and Management at the Government Accountability Office. And I love the GAO. It is the GAO's job to soberly assess the government and tell Congress and the American people what's really going on. And here's the part of her testimony from March 4th to the Senate Committee on Armed Services that stuck with me.
Over the course of several administrations, the military has overused and undermaintained too many weapon systems for too long. And for years, the services have stretched to meet demanding operational needs with fewer people, older equipment and facilities, and a shrinking industrial base. At the same time, the department is all too often not realistically planned for how to sustain ships, aircraft, ground vehicles, and other systems. And across the services, we found a lack of spare parts, maintainers, repair facilities, technical data, training, and other problems. And as a result, too many systems that taxpayers have spent billions to build and maintain are not mission capable.
So playing year-round Santa of weapons to Taiwan and Israel and Ukraine while skimping on maintenance of our own equipment, it appears that this has had consequences. And what I'm afraid of, which is an educated fear, is that we're not ready for a huge war. But before I get to our readiness, while we're speaking of playing weapons Santa, let's talk about Ukraine real quick, because it's been, ho season nonstop for the Ukrainians since 2014. But this year in Ukraine, it appears that Santa is finally going to get to rest because there was no specific money pot for Ukraine in this funding bill, even though $400 million for Ukraine was authorized in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a good lesson in how legislation works. Just because something is authorized, just because something is allowed in an authorization law, the money needs to come in an appropriations bill. And this time for Ukraine, it didn't. And this is the first time in years that I haven't seen any money at all in the defense funding for Ukraine. And so, congratulations, Vladimir Putin. But now let's get back to our military readiness, because one particular area that even the military commanders couldn't pretend was okie dokie just days after President Trump launched another Middle East war had to do with our amphibious ships, which are the kind of military ship designed to launch and support troops going from land to sea. And as you listen to this testimony from March 4th, you should know that as I speak, we have thousands of U.S. troops on ships heading towards Iran. Here's Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral James Kilby of the U.S. Navy.
Sir, my ability to deliver amphibious maintenance has been challenged, and I've been very clear about that. And last year, when I testified, we were at 42% combat surge ready for our amphibious ships. This year, we're at 53%. I don't feel good about that.
So right now, our ships have a readiness problem, which brings me to the littoral combat ships. Now, I've talked about these ships before in episode 269, which was about the defense authorization for 2023. That episode was called Plan Ecuador, which is a country, by the way, that President Trump just low-key bombed on March 7th while we were all paying attention to the expanding war he started in Iran. But the bombing of Ecuador occurred in a murder operation that they called total extermination, and which was aimed at what they say is a training site belonging to some group accused of being drug traffickers. But I should be clear that this unauthorized by Congress bombing was done in partnership with the government of Ecuador. But let's add Ecuador to the list of countries that the peace candidate Trump has bombed in the last 15 months. By my count, we're up to 8. But anyway, let's get back to the littoral combat ships. Because in this funding law for 2026, there's a section that says that, quote, none of the funds made available by this act may be obligated or expended for the purpose of decommissioning more than one littoral combat ship, unquote. And back in early 2023, we talked about the littoral combat ships because the NDAA for that year protected the ships from being trashed, just like this year's funding bill does. And so while that hasn't changed, I do want to bring this up again because we are seeing the negative consequences of these decisions by Congress to protect ships that suck in order to protect the profits of generous corporations. So a quick reminder of what these ships are. Littoral combat ships were invented after September 11th to fight so-called non-traditional threats, as in random groups of people who aren't fighting as part of a military effort, so like the terrorists. But these ships suck. First of all, they're expensive. They cost double what they were supposed to cost. But second, and more importantly, they have had all kinds of safety problems and operational problems. And I go into detail on that in episode 269 from 3 years ago, if you care. But basically, the military doesn't like these things to the point that they have the nickname little crappy ships. And so even though the ships are relatively new, in 2022, the military announced that they want to retire most of them and invest our money instead in ships that work. But the companies that make money repairing the little crappy ships, like BAE Systems, well, companies like that would lose money if the ships were sent to the junkyard, where the military prefers them to be. And so those companies called up their lobbying army and invaded Capitol Hill. And 3 years later, their efforts are still paying off, and the little crappy ships are still being forced into use by Congress. Well, here are the consequences. If you have been paying any attention at all to the Iran war, you probably know that the big, bad United States Navy is essentially powerless right now to protect the ships that need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz to deliver Middle East oil and gas to the world. The reason these ships need protection is that the Strait of Hormuz is neighbored by Iran, and the Iranians are credibly threatening to bomb ships that pass through without their permission. And they have successfully bombed ships already because we can't stop them. Well, why can't we stop them? Well, partially because the majority of the ships that the U.S. military has near the Strait of Hormuz are 3 little crappy ships stationed in Bahrain. And Congress forcing the military to keep little crappy ships is likely part of the reason that we can't do anything about this blockade. Had the military been allowed to invest our money in ships that they have more confidence in, perhaps the oil markets and entire global economy wouldn't be in such a precarious position right now. But BAE Systems, which repairs the problem-ridden little crappy ships and lobbied Congress to protect them from the trash heap, lobbying expenses that amounted to over $4 million per year? Well, BAE Systems reported last year that they are experiencing rising profits and a larger dividend to shareholders. And so for them, all is right in this world. Learning nothing, Congress is also preventing the military from canceling the development and purchase of E-7 wedge-tail aircraft, which are currently in the process of being invented by Boeing, a company that spends about $13 million per year lobbying Congress, and people associated with Boeing shower Congress with campaign contributions totaling about $5 million per year. And I'm sure by total coincidence that a company that blows that much money on Capitol Hill is then gifted a provision in law that requires the military to keep paying Boeing to invent its E-7 wedge-tail aircraft, even though the military doesn't want it and requested to stop paying Boeing billions of our dollars for these planes. Now, the reason the military wants to stop paying for these planes is because, besides the cost overruns and delays, the planes have a, quote, survivability issue, unquote. Because you see, the E-7 planes are radar planes, which are supposed to track enemy aircraft and missiles. But the military would rather use space-based tracking systems that can track aircraft and missiles across the world instead of just tracking the area around these expensive planes. And the survivability issue is kind of obvious. Radar planes can be shot down, making them vulnerable in a war during which long-range missiles are being used, such as the war that President Trump just started against Iran. And so the military's reasoning here, it sure makes sense to me, but our bought-off Congress provided welfare to Boeing and kept the radar plane project alive. And on March 13th, even though they didn't want to spend our money on these planes, the military awarded Boeing 2 sole source contracts for these planes worth over $5 billion. And so when you hear that the military wastes our money, well, it's true, they do. But sometimes it's because Congress is rigging their financial decisions in law in ways that benefit certain companies. And finally, Congress is again preventing the military from trashing equipment it doesn't want in Section 8055, which prevents the military from retiring, planning to retire, or placing in storage any C-40 aircraft unless it's due to a Class A mishap, which is the most serious level of accident used by the military to classify events. So like accidents that result in death, serious disability, or destruction of the plane. And why am I telling you this? Well, because the C-4 airplanes are the kind of planes used by members of Congress when they travel for free around the world on their CODEL trips or congressional delegation trips. So fewer of these planes being maintained by the military would mean it would be harder for members of Congress to schedule themselves freebie trips around the world. And they give away this game in the text of the actual law, because the last paragraph of this section says, quote, "Not later than 90 days after the date of the enactment of this act, the Secretary of Defense shall submit to the Congressional Defense Committees a report on the necessary steps taken by the Department of Defense to meet the travel requirements for official or representational duties of members of Congress and the Cabinet in fiscal years 2026 and 2027, unquote. This Congress, man, it is just full of self-serving pricks. So that was the Department of Defense, which, yes, is still named the Department of Defense. I am not calling it Department of War to like stroke Pete Hegseth's war boners. But anyway, looking in this law and laws over the past, 13 years, it's been an interesting and recurring phenomenon over the years that fans of Congressional Dish have said that listening to Congressional Dish can be like having a crystal ball, because we've been able to predict the future, especially in matters of war, quite a few times over the years. But I'll let you in on my witchy ways, which is that when I want to glimpse into that crystal ball to see what countries are up next on our target list, I don't look at the Defense Department authorizations and funding laws. I now look at the Department of State. And there is a section of funding in the Department of State funding laws that I always look to for this type of information. And that is the section about the National Endowment for Democracy. Now, I produced a whole episode about the National Endowment for Democracy. I produced it in 2018, and it remains tied for the third most valuable episode as determined by the financial contributions of our executive producers. And by the way, you can add a credit to the episode that you consider most valuable every time you contribute a total of $535. But we've had 5 executive producers do that for the National Endowment for Democracy episode, and that episode it stays at the top of the list year after year after year. And the reason is that National Endowment for Democracy rabbit hole, it was a doozy and remains so to this day because nothing has really changed. And I am still amazed that this organization is allowed to exist. So real quick, the National Endowment for Democracy was created in 1983 by President Ronald Reagan. And it was created in order to take many of the election interference tests that the CIA was caught doing in the 1970s, which back then, those were treated like scandals. Well, the National Endowment for Democracy was essentially bringing that spook out of the shadows. And in doing so, it made the funneling of money to low-key regime change actions easier to collect, because the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created by Congress, well, they created it as a private non-governmental organization. And so it gets money every year via the State Department funding laws. But because it's a private NGO, it's also allowed to raise money from groups outside the government. And so basically, the National Endowment for Democracy can take our tax money and private money too. Even the CIA doesn't have that much financial freedom. And according to the founding, the first president of the National Endowment for Democracy, Carl Gershman, he said, quote, "The idea behind making the National Endowment for Democracy private was to remove it from all of the entangling diplomatic obligations of the United States," unquote. It's designed to get us around U.S. diplomatic obligations. It's designed to break the promises that we've officially made to the world. And the way they fund their independent actions is by passing money out to all kinds of groups. And the names of most of these groups are kept secret. They say for the safety of those groups, which, to be fair, does make sense. If you have a list of groups interfering in other countries' politics and elections, they would likely be targets of sanctions and expulsions and even violence. But half of the National Endowment for Democracy money goes to 4 groups that we do know the identities of, including the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, which are full of elite members of the Republican and Democratic parties. And even though all of this was designed to look like it's completely disconnected from our government, it's not. It's not really independent. Because both of these organizations, well, they were created at the same exact time as the National Endowment for Democracy, so they're kind of connected to that. And Congress, which consists of only Republicans and Democrats, it funnels millions of dollars every year through the National Endowment for Democracy to these organizations that are staffed by themselves. In fact, current members of Congress even sit on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy today. And actually, when I produced episode 186 about the National Endowment for Democracy, then Senator Marco Rubio, who is our current Secretary of State and main architect of the regime change in Venezuela and ongoing attempt at regime change in Iran and biggest cheerleader for the upcoming regime change in Cuba, well, he was on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm telling you, this thing is absolutely wild. Seriously, listen to episode 186. There are so many more details about this shady organization. But even though I find its existence to be mind-bogglingly corrupt, the Republicans and Democrats who fund it every year in Congress and funnel money to themselves to meddle in other countries with our tax money, they act like this organization is the most normal thing in the world. And yet again, with no pushback from any Americans, they funded the National Endowment for Democracy with quite a bit of money. And the National Endowment for Democracy and so-called democracy program section of the State Department, that is where I always look to find out where our next targets of regime change probably are. Those are the regime change funds. And so, for 2026, our Congress set aside over $2 billion for so-called democracy programs. And they also said in this law that $2 billion and the over $300 million, which is specifically for the National Endowment for Democracy, quote, may be available notwithstanding any other provision of law and with regard to the National Endowment for Democracy, any regulation, unquote. This is essentially saying that the National Endowment for Democracy can spend money even if other laws and rules would prohibit our money being spent that way. In practice, this means that the National Endowment for Democracy can fund groups who are not allowed by law to get our tax money. And it can go to places where our tax money is not allowed to go. And on top of that, the law says that these democracy programs, quote, shall not be subject to prior approval by the government of any foreign country, unquote. Which at least makes sense, because of course, a government is not going to give you permission to come into its country and pay random groups of minions to spread bullshit and meddle in elections and essentially attempt to overthrow it. And by the way, this law specifically authorized the democracy programs to occur inside Iran. Now, currently, the National Endowment for Democracy's president and CEO is Damon Wilson, who worked in, the Iraq regime-changing George W. Bush administration and was on W's National Security Council. And this guy testified to the House Appropriations Committee 4 days before the Iran war was launched by Israel and President Trump. And like I said, Iran was listed in the law itself, so of course that was a target. And so, who else is on the target list? Well, here's National Endowment for Democracy's president and CEO, Damon Wilson.
So Nicaragua, after Venezuela, Cuba, it's our third largest program in the Western Hemisphere, reflecting the nature of a pretty extreme repression from the Ortega Murillo regime following their return to power.
And that statement matches the money. So there was $50 million in the funding law for democracy programs aimed at Venezuela, even though President Trump already kidnapped its president by the time this became law. Cuba is also a clear target of the democracy programs, which will have at least $25 million aimed at it, plus whatever the National Endowment for Democracy regime changers decide to add. And I think we all kind of know that Cuba is next on the Trump regime change list because, well, President Dum Dum said so.
But I think Cuba's seen the end. All my life I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation right now. They were for a long time.
He said that on March 16th. And on top of those statements, we also haven't allowed any oil from any country to enter Cuba since the Venezuela kidnapping/regime change in January, which is causing extreme suffering on the island as its power grid has collapsed. So basically, the Trump administration is already waging a vicious economic war and is openly discussing taking the country, whatever that means. But Nicaragua, I think that's going to be news to a lot of people, but it's clearly on the list. Because on top of the comments made by the president and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy that you just heard, confirming that they are big-time meddling in Nicaragua, well, in the State Department 2026 funding law, there's also $15 million in democracy programs aimed at Nicaragua. So, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. My crystal ball says that's the regime change list. And then finally, I also want to tell you about one more thing in the State Department funding, which is the America First Opportunity Fund. Now, this fund is given $850 million of our money, taken from other sections of the State Department funding. And the law says that it can be used to, quote, furnish assistance that makes America safer, stronger, and more prosperous by responding to crises, engaging proactively with strategic partners, and countering threats from adversaries, unquote. Which is as vague as it gets. And so I went looking for the fund itself to see what it's actually authorized to do, and I found that the America First Opportunity Fund doesn't actually exist. And so what this means in practice is that $850 million is basically being allowed to be sloshed around between 4 existing funds as desired by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. In other words, it's a slush fund. It's a pool of money taken from other places with really no restrictions on what can be done with it once it's in the America First pool, as long as it can be said that the money was used to make America safer and prosperous and it countered a threat. And I can tell you that little Marco, he is very talented in the art of crafting that type of word salad. Okay, my friend, so we have made it through the war sections. And so now let's look at the domestic funding, starting with the section for health, labor, and education. In the Department of Health section, 2 things jumped out at me. So first is section 231, which says that no money can be given to a company that houses unaccompanied children that is not state licensed. But it then inserts a big fat exception, which allows children to be housed in unlicensed facilities when the Secretary of Health and Human Services, so RFK Jr., says that it's necessary because of an emergency, and emergency is not defined. And this raises red flags for me because we know that this administration has abused emergency powers in so many ways. Like even the Supreme Court has said so. And so if RFK Jr. says there's some kind of emergency, which when it comes to immigration, President Trump already has, and so while under an emergency, whether it's real or fake, this law lets children be housed in unlicensed facilities for essentially an unlimited amount of time, as long as those facilities have the same requirements as licensed locations. But it's also important to note that this isn't enforced in any kind of way. That also says that these facilities have to abide by staffing requirements. But, those requirements can be waived for 8 months, which is a long time if you're the child living in substandard and understaffed facilities. And so basically, Congress gave private companies wiggle room on standards for housing of children. And I look at this as a corporate favor because it's certainly not intended to ensure the best care for kids. The other provision that jumped out at me was Section 233, and this one says that no money can be used to prevent members of Congress from entering any facility in the United States used for housing unaccompanied children. But the members of Congress have to give those facilities 2 business days heads up, which is plenty of time for them to clean up their shit. But it's worth knowing that members of Congress are being prevented from entering ICE facilities. And so permission this explicit is necessary with this administration. And at least it's good that this one was included in law. I would love to see a similar one for ICE facilities. Okay, moving on now to the Department of Labor. There was one section that was notable in the Department of Labor funding. That is Section 409, which prevents the National Labor Relations Board from issuing any regulation that allows employees the ability to vote for union representation electronically, which is simply a way to prevent broader union participation. And I mean, you can kind of see exactly how this works. Voting online is easy, and it could allow work from home employees or workers in large companies, which are spread out across many locations, and gig workers the ability to unionize. Now, to be fair, there is an argument that is made in favor of preventing electronic voting, and the argument is that electronic voting is not as secure as paper voting. Which, when it comes to our governmental elections, like I'm all about paper trails. And so there is an argument to be made there. But if corporations have figured out electronic voting for their shareholders, which they have, employees should be allowed to figure it out too. But this is exactly the type of rigging of the system in favor of bosses and the shareholder class that is typical under Republican Party rule. And so here we go. Yet again, another bit of unfairness to workers has made it into law. All right, so now we're going to move over into the Department of Education section. And the news there is that the Department of Education still exists and is funded. And so included in that funding is education for children with disabilities and children from financially disadvantaged families. The Department of Education funded school improvement programs and Indian education and school safety initiatives and citizenship education and English language education and student loans for higher education. And I, for one, am happy to see it. And then finally, in this section, there is pages and pages and pages and pages of congressionally directed spending. And these are earmarks. And you can find all of the earmarks in the explanatory statement for the Labor, Health, and Education section of funding. And I put that in the show notes for you. But essentially, the earmarks or the congressionally directed spending, these are projects that members of Congress get funded in their local communities. And so just to give you an example of what kind of things get funded, I looked up my own members of Congress. And as someone who was raised in California and all of my immediate family members still live in that state, I looked up California. And so for this section of funding, it was only senators that got to put in projects for some reason. And so I looked up California senators who are Adam Schiff and I can't remember his first name, but Senator Padilla. And they requested a lot of things together, actually. And so, for example, they got $3.5 million for medical education equipment for the University of California. They got $1.3 million to renovate emergency medical facilities in Mono, California. They got $1.8 million for a behavioral health facility at Ridgecrest Regional Hospital. And they got $2 million for Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego for pediatric mental health services. And they got more. And so then I looked at my current senators because I'm back in Austin, Texas. And my Texas senators, Ted Cruz and John Cornyn, who, by the way, is up for re-election or firing this year. And I can tell you that neither of them got a single thing for the great state of Texas. And so you can find out what your senators got for you by opening the explanatory statement PDF in this episode's show notes. Control F, search your senator's name, and see what they got for you in the chart. All right, moving on to the next section of funding, we are looking at transportation and housing. So let's start with transportation. Overall, here are the subsidies by transportation type. For auto travel, we are subsidizing cars and trucks by $64 billion. For air travel, we are subsidizing that by $22 billion. And for rail travel, we are subsidizing it by $2.5 billion. Now, I also feel the need to remind you that out of those three, only passenger rail, Amtrak, is expected to pay for itself and is considered a failure when it struggles to do so, at least by Republicans paid off by the fossil fuel industry. But forcing Americans to own cars in order to get around in our country is a deliberate choice, and you can see it in the numbers, because we do subsidize travel in this country with our tax money. We just choose to give 72% of our money to car infrastructure, 25% to fossil fuel guzzling planes, and only 3% to rail. And so that's why passenger rail sucks here in the United States. And this is your annual reminder that it does not have to stay this way. And then as a follow-up to episode 152, this was an episode from 2017 in the beginning of the first Trump administration. Well, back then I produced an episode about conversations that were being had in that Congress about privatizing air traffic control. The information and testimony that I gathered for that episode led me to think it would be a bad idea, which makes me happy to see Section 119G prevented money from being used to privatize air traffic control or to even plan to privatize it. Moving on to the housing section, the only thing that really jumped out at me in the housing section is that it created the quote, Melania Trump Foster Youth to Independence Initiative, unquote, which is not a new initiative, and it's something Melania Trump had absolutely nothing to do with creating. What happened here is that Congress, Republicans, I'm guessing, took an existing program that provides $25 million of our tax money for housing vouchers for foster kids who turn 18 and are on their own for the first time. They took that existing program for those kids and slapped her name on it. And obviously, this doesn't really matter, but it just shows what brown nosers the Republicans are to the Trump family. And then just like with the last section of government that we looked at, the labor, health, and education section, there is an explanatory statement for transportation and housing that is full of earmarks. And so you can see what kind of transportation and housing projects that your House and Senate members got for you. And so for this one, I looked up my 3 members of Congress in the House and the Senate. And so what my representatives got for me is that my representative in the House is a Democrat named Lloyd Doggett. And Representative Doggett got us $3.5 million to extend the West Bolden Creek Trail and $2 million to connect 2 other trails. And then for housing, Representative Doggett got us $2 million for safety and security upgrades in Travis County, got $1.5 million for tech education equipment for Austin School District. And my favorite, he got us $500,000 for tree planting in the city of Austin so that it's more comfortable to walk around here when it's hotter than hell, as it is for about half the year. Looking at what my senators did for us, once again, Senators Cruz and Cornyn didn't bother to get us shit. And so it's just a reminder that it's not beneficial to your local community to elect people who don't believe in government and who don't bother to do what they can do to get you a return on your federal tax investments. And so I'm curious, what did your members of Congress get for you? Let me know in the comments on the Patreon poll. All right. And now we're moving on to our last section of government that was funded, and that is financial services and general government. And there were a few things that jumped out at me in this part of the funding. So first, there is a whole section here that has to do with recreational off-highway vehicles, or ROVs. Now, these are little cars. I don't even want to call them cars because they look like baby Jeeps. But these things are used on trails and farms. They're used by hunters and by the military. And they have steering wheels, and they usually have seating for 2. And all of the people seats they're inside of a roll cage. So it's basically like bars that go around you that protect the riders in case these things roll over. And that's important because they have a known history of rolling over when turning sharply or on uneven terrain. And hundreds of Americans have died in these things. Well, in 2014, the Consumer Product Safety Commission issued a regulation that aimed to reduce rollover crashes by requiring manufacturers to design these to make them less likely to roll over by making them wider. They also ordered them to lower their center of gravity and therefore provide them better balance. The regulation also aimed to standardize tests of these things to measure stability and handling so that regulators could verify compliance. And as you can imagine, the manufacturers didn't like this regulation. They didn't like that they would have to redesign their products and pay for the tests, both of which cost the companies money, which they no likey. And the safety standards would lower the top speeds and make the dune buggies less awesome to the people who buy these for funsies and for whom the danger, I guess, is part of the fun. The companies that lobbied against the regulation said that they already had voluntary standards and those are fine. Just, ignore the dead people. And so this provision in 2026, it didn't stop the regulation like we've seen other regulations stopped this year in those standalone regulation killer bills that the Republicans churned out damn near daily for the first few months of this Congress. Those bills killed the regulation and prevented similar zombies from ever reappearing. This one has a different strategy. This one postpones the regulation on these ROV vehicles until a pain-in-the-ass study that requires coordination from multiple agencies is done, proving the necessity of the regulation. Now, theoretically, that shouldn't be that tall of a hurdle. But this provision has been in funding law after funding law for over a decade. And so the stall tactic for industry is working beautifully, and their less than safe products are still being sold. And thanks to a decade of bought-off Congresses, Americans are still dying, including a 7-year-old in Nebraska who died just this past January when his 9-year-old brother, who was driving, took a sharp turn and the recreational vehicle rolled over. It also killed 6-year-old Raul Chavez, who was killed when the driver lost control and the vehicle rolled over, killing him and injuring 3 other children. And it's not just kids who are dying in these things. 59-year-old Lonnie Conley of Oklahoma, his ROV rolled over 3 or 4 times and killed him the week of this recording. These are the exact situations the regulation from 12 years ago was meant to prevent. Had Congress stayed out of it, this would have been plenty of time for the regulations to take effect and safer vehicles to be sold, without us customers having to do any research to make sure that we're buying vehicles that don't just flip over. But no, our members of Congress cited year after year, death after death with the industry that had lobbyists who collectively spent hundreds of thousands of dollars sending schmoozers to Congress to plead their fake poverty. These are the quiet dangers of living in the United States of America with a Congress that constantly proves itself to be more sympathetic to industry complaints about costs than about our safety. Along those same lines, the funding law, for the 3rd year, has a provision in it preventing any regulation to ban gas stoves in response to fake outrage from 2023 over a regulation to ban gas stoves that does not exist and has never been proposed. But regardless, this is great for fossil fuel companies who have been gifted a preemptive regulation stopper guaranteeing their products can continue to pollute the inside of our homes with nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide and fine particulate matter and benzene, which is likely causing asthma in children. And then finally, this section of the funding law has to do with the weed. So in December of 2025, President Trump issued an executive order telling his government to expedite the process that would change marijuana from a Schedule I drug, which is the most restrictive category for drugs with no medical benefit, to a Schedule III. But that hasn't happened yet. Marijuana, as of this recording, is still a Schedule I despite its known medical benefits. But Congress is preventing marijuana legalization even if President Trump is able to reschedule it. This new funding law says, quote, none of the federal funds contained in this act may be used to enact or carry out any law, rule, or regulation to legalize or otherwise reduce penalties associated with the possession, use, or distribution of any Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act or any and I don't know how I'm going to say this word, any tetrahydrocannabinols derivative, which basically means THC. And so this prohibition on reducing penalties applies to marijuana, THC, Delta 8, Delta 9, regardless of what the scheduling is. Now, the good news for us stoners is that this applies only to this act. And so it would have to be included in the next funding law to remain effective past September 30th of this year. But much of these funding bills get copy-pasted year after year, and so stoners better speak up if they want this to die. Because there was an anti-Delta 8/Delta 9 provision that was slipped into law earlier this year, and that's going to be effective right around the midterm election. And so I promise you that this issue is going to be a big story later this year, and the time to speak up is now. And then I lied to you. That wasn't the last part of the funding law. There was also one more in the financial services section I want to tell you about, and that was in the Treasury Department section number 123, which says that no money is allowed to be used by the Treasury Department or IRS to change the regulation that sets the standard for what is and what is not a social welfare organization. By law, they have to use the standard that was in place on January 1st, 2010. And let me be clear about this. This is a provision that protects secret campaign contributions. Now, I explained this whole thing best in 2016 in an episode that I really wish that I didn't name the impeachment of John Koskinen. But in that episode, the Republicans were trying to impeach the Obama-era IRS commissioner for doing his job, specifically for policing political groups that were pretending to be social welfare organizations because social welfare organizations get to keep their donors secret. The loophole that allows these dark money groups to corrupt our elections by misclassifying themselves rests upon just a couple of words in the regulation that, if changed, could shut this dark money funnel down. And members of Congress who benefit from dark money don't want that. And so in this funding law, they have prohibited the changing of any words that define social welfare organizations. Once again, proving that this Congress is full of self-serving pricks. Now, we're almost done with the funding law, but it is time for the dingleberries. And I'm actually pleased to tell you about the juiciest dingleberry in this law, because it is eventually going to expose and hopefully stop some of the fuckery committed by PBMs. So pharmaceutical benefit managers, PBMs, are middlemen between insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. They negotiate prices and then take a cut, sometimes a huge cut, of money that they theoretically saved by the deal they brokered. PBMs are shady, and I produced a whole episode about them in 2022. It's episode number 255. But for this funding law, you don't need to know all the details about PBMs. You just need to know that they are shady pricing middlemen between insurance companies and the drugs we need. One of the problems identified with our system that relies on PBMs for pricing is how the PBMs make pricing deals, what those deals are, and the results of their deals. Well, all of that is pretty much a black box. There's nowhere to find that information. And so Congress changed that as a dingleberry to the funding law. And so starting for everyone on January 1st, 2029, so we still have to wait a while, but at the beginning of 2029, Congress will be requiring that PBMs give information to health insurance companies about drugs every 6 months, and they have to give over a lot of information. So the PBMs are going to have to tell insurance companies the amount that the insurance companies are paying for each drug. They have to tell them how much money is being paid to the pharmacies for that drug. They have to give them the wholesale costs of the drugs. They have to tell the insurance companies how much we, their customers, are spending out of pocket on each drug. They're going to have to tell our insurance companies the total amount of rebates and discounts and fees. And they're going to have to tell them the money that is being given to brokers and consultants and advisors and other useless middlemen, and more. And while Congress didn't prohibit insurance companies who own pharmacies and pharmacy benefit managers, because yes, some companies own all three, which is a control of the system so complete that it's an obvious antitrust problem and it has been proven to be corrupting, well, that's still allowed. But corrupt incentives that steer customers to do business within the parent company, while still allowed, will have to be documented on paper. And there are real financial penalties for failing to provide this information by the PBMs. The companies are going to be charged $10,000 per day that each violation continues, $10,000 per day that information remains missing. And if they provide false information, they can be fined $100,000 for, quote, each item of false information, unquote. Now, the documents are meant to be internal between the PBMs and insurance companies. And in the companies where those are the same company, that doesn't do much for general transparency, especially because the law also says that the PBM that prepares the document is allowed to place restrictions on it being made public. But a document that exists is one that can be demanded by shareholders, or subpoenaed, or leaked. And the companies are expressly allowed to give the information to the Department of Health and Human Services and the Labor Department or the Treasury Department. Also, as someone with health insurance, you are going to be allowed to request information from your health insurance company that they will have pretty soon that shows these numbers for drugs that you have personally paid for. And so you will be entitled to some behind-the-scenes pricing for your insurance claims for the first time. And so even though this probably won't be public information, the important part for now is that the information is going to be gathered. It's going to exist, and some of it will get out. And this is an improvement on our trash healthcare system. And we can build on this in a better Congress. And so that's it for the funding law. But Congress also got 4 other laws passed to the finish line. So let me tell you about those real quick. So one of our new laws is HJ Res 142, and this has to do with Washington, D.C. taxes. Basically, Washington, D.C.'s City Council enacted a tax bill at the end of 2025. But because Congress has effective control over the city of Washington, D.C. in a way that it doesn't control any other city in the country, Congress essentially killed the tax bill enacted by local leaders and instead forces Washington, D.C. to enact tax policy from the big, beautiful bill against its wishes. Congress also accomplished S 3424, the Bankruptcy Administration Improvement Act of 2025. And this increases fees paid to bankruptcy court middlemen, trustees, who are private individuals who are appointed by the Department of Justice, so Pam Bondi and friends. And the amount that they are going to get paid per case is going to more than double. Now, to pay for this, businesses who declare Chapter 11 type bankruptcies are going to pay more in fees. And Chapter 11 bankruptcies are expensive and therefore are generally used by big businesses. Like Chapter 11 is the kind of bankruptcy that Donald Trump has declared at least 5 times. And obviously, he was financially fine. And so I don't think there's any need to feel bad for the Chapter 11 deadbeats for this fee increase. Or at least I'm not weeping for them. Because smaller businesses often use the Chapter 7 bankruptcy process, and that kind is protected from increased fees. Now, the fees are the main changes in this new law, but then some judges' terms in office are also extended. So okay, fine. Congress also accomplished S-269, the Ending Improper Payments to Deceased People Act, and this one allows the Treasury Department to access death records maintained by the Social Security Administration in order to stop payments to dead people. And then the last thing Congress accomplished was S-3705, which requires the creation of a congressional time capsule that will be buried in the Capitol Visitor Center on July 4th, 2026, in honor of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Inside the time capsule to represent the 119th Congress will be a MAGA hat, a rubber stamp, and a plane ticket. I made that last part up, but that's what I would include. And that's it. That's all your Congress did in the month of February. They finished government funding for 5 out of 12 segments of government 4.5 months late, and still didn't finish their homework because the Department of Homeland Security has been shut down since Valentine's Day. And then they fucked with DC's taxes, tinkered with bankruptcy fees, stopped payments to deads, and created a time capsule to honor themselves. That was an entire month's worth of work. So are we proud? Let me know your grade for Congress in the month of February, and I can't wait to read your thoughts. So now I would like to thank our executive producers. Like I mentioned before, these are people that have contributed a cumulative $535 for each executive producer credit. And every time you get a credit, you can put it on the episode you consider the most valuable, and it controls the most valuable episodes list. Anytime a new listener asks me where to start, that is where I send them. And I have just found it to be so accurate. I absolutely love this system because I think it really does represent the most valuable episodes. And I'm really, really thrilled that we now have 4 executive producer credits on episode 334, Untrained and Unwarranted. That is the last episode. I think it's one of the most important ones I've done, certainly of this Congress. I really wanted it on the first page. And so with these executive producer credits, we now have 4 executive producers on it, which puts it on the first page for new listeners. And one more credit, by the way, will put it pretty close to the top. So if anyone's got one in their back pocket that they want to spend on that, that would be awesome. But yeah, so I really want to thank David Waldstein, who put a credit on Untrained and Unwarranted. Thank you for your support, David. I also want to thank Adrian Robles, who did the same thing, put a credit on Congressional Dish 334. And Adrian sent in a note. He said, this is very valuable information and puts into perspective all of the shortcuts that this administration is taking to achieve whatever goals they have. As an immigrant, I am grateful to have this source of information that goes beyond the propaganda. And I'm so grateful for your support for it. So thank you, Adrian. I'm also super grateful for Leslie Behan. She has been supporting this show for so long. Every time I see her name, it feels like I'm seeing a friend's name, to be honest with you. And she just put 2 executive producer credits on 2 episodes that I consider so important. So she put 1 credit on the Big Beautiful Bill episode and put 1 credit on Untrained and Unwarranted. And she sent in a message. She said, I want to keep Congressional Dish 320 on the top of the list. That's One Big Beautiful Bill, so that Republicans will be exposed as the party that hurts the majority of Americans while protecting corporations and the wealthy. For my second executive producer credit, I chose the latest episode, Congressional Dish 334, Untrained and Unwarranted, to expose this corrupt and lawless administration and to support the brave whistleblowers. I'm a longtime listener / supporter whose heart skips a beat when Jen talks about ending her podcast. I believe listening to Congressional Dish should be required for every voter instead of proving citizenship. Ooh, I would love that. Please wish Jen a happy birthday for me. Thanks, Leslie Behan. Thanks for supporting the show. And obviously I haven't quit doing this show yet, but I've got to tell you that sometimes it just hurts my mental health, man. I actually said to someone the other day that Trump's madness, I mean, obviously it drives us all a little crazy, but he's not the one that's really getting to me lately. It's Congress and their just lack of willing to do anything about it. It's like, I've always known Trump is nuts, but the way that Congress is just like bent over and let him do whatever he wants, like that is what is making me mentally ill. But yeah, I'm not quitting this anytime soon. I don't think. So thank you for supporting me. And also thank you for wishing me a happy birthday. Yesterday, March 26th was my birthday. I didn't really want anything all that special for my birthday. What I was really craving was a salsa bar. And so I was being asked by friends, like, what are you doing for your birthday? And I kept saying, like, all I want is a salsa bar. Apparently, a lot of people thought that meant that I wanted to go salsa dancing. But the truth was a lot more literal than that. I wanted to go to a restaurant where there was a variety of salsas that I could funnel into my face with tortilla chips. Like, that's the salsa bar that I was interested in. And actually, I got the salsa bar and only ate one of the salsas because it was delicious. So I got exactly what I wanted for my birthday. I also ate 10 mini cupcakes, and that was a very fun indulgence. I'm a very simple creature. I didn't really want much. But yeah, Joe spoiled me, and I had some good friends. I had a friend take me out for a drink, and then we had friends go out to dinner. So it was a good birthday. I made it another year around the sun. So yeah, thanks for saying that. But also, thank you for putting an executive producer credit on the Big Beautiful Bill episode, because with that credit, the Big Beautiful Bill episode is now the undisputed #1 most valuable episode. So Leslie, you made a big difference on that one. All right, so I am going to walk away from this computer for a few days, but I am going to go to the No Kings protest. This is, I don't know how much of a difference it's going to make, but it's one of the things we can do, right? I call my members of Congress. I produce this show. I feel like I can be a body that's at least part of the picture, showing that I am not happy with what is happening with this administration. So I'm going to bring the dog out there and I'm going to go stand around with other people who are sick of this shit. I hope other people are doing that as well. I do know that the people that go to these protests generally tend to feel better. So even if it doesn't really do much, who cares? Let's at least try it. So yeah, I'm going to do that this weekend, and I'm going to stay off of the news for a few days, because on Monday, I'm going to get right back to reading laws to summarize March for you. We're going to do that one right away. And helping me do this, I am positive, is going to be Claire, who is my production and research assistant. I absolutely love the work she does for me. I also want to thank Mike at Pro Podcast Solutions. He's the reason that listening to me talk is tolerable. Thank you to Mark at podcastbranding.co, who does our web design and security. Thank you to my sister Lauren, who does our bookkeeping and is our executive producer services specialist, which is a title I totally made up. Thank you to my dad and Robin, who need to get on my taxes. They're due in 2 weeks. And thank you to Brian, who is our guardian angel. He is our artist, and we are going to miss him forever and ever. All right. I will talk to you as soon as I can get March summarized. So yeah, take care of yourself, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite of any in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You
bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.